Hi, welcome to the Lorne Epstein Show. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein, here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. And today we're broadcasting from Las Vegas, Nevada at the Unleash HR Technology Conference. We're talking to HR experts about all sorts of things. Today I have two very special guests to talk about an issue that's in the headlines, and I think in our consciousness, probably as long as anyone who's been listening has been alive, but it's the idea that men and women have struggles in relating to each other, particularly in the workplace. And there's been a lot of bad stuff that's gone on between the sexes, the genders, and we're going to talk about that. So with me today we have Janine Truitt, who is the Chief Information Officer for Talent Think Innovations, which is a business strategy and management consulting firm. She's the founder and chief blogger at the Aristocracy of HR, and host of Periscope TV show Ask Zarina Live. Janine is a dynamic speaker, entrepreneur, respected voice bringing a human touch to business. Janine has been quoted by Harvard Business Review, Newsday, the Society for Human Resource Management, U.S. News, Careers, and has been featured by Entrepreneurs and Fast Company. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. And also with us today we have Stacia Garr. Stacia Garr is a professional with a background working in talent management, diversity and inclusion, and HR technology. She has done research in the field and has much to share, and hopefully she'll share some of that with us today. She is a frequent speaker and writer. Her work has been featured in Fortune, Forbes, and the New York Times. She has co-founded RedThread Research in 2018 after having a leadership role at Burson by Deloitte. And Josh Burson is a pretty cool guy, so if you're one of his disciples, I'm sure you've learned a lot about our field. So it's critical, I think, really to create a culture of inclusiveness. And the role of HR, has a huge impact, or can have a huge impact on that. So let's dive in. I mean, what has been going on in the last 10 or 20 years and beyond in the workplace that we haven't really embraced or taken a look at?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about from the perspective of diversity and inclusion, it's been so many organizations have just had a compliance focus on diversity and inclusion, so making sure that they're legally compliant with the EEOC requirements, et cetera. And it's been a relatively small percentage of organizations who have been focused on diversity and inclusion from a more strategic perspective, meaning that they are trying to really focus on bringing people together and bringing the best out of them to make an impact on the business. Mm-hmm. So that's a big shift that we've seen. But a huge percentage of organizations have remained on the compliance focus or have only started to make the shift in the last 5 years.
Sure. I mean, I'm 53, so through my lifetime, back in the 60s when my mom was working, there wasn't any, there weren't a whole lot of protections for folks, right? Title VII wasn't around, and all these other rules that create a little more fairness in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And we saw very few women rising to the top of businesses. We saw a lot of sexual harassment, discrimination in housing, discrimination in everything, mm-hmm. right? For all sorts of reasons. And all of a sudden now, boom, we're becoming more woke, right, about these things, right? More awakened to mm-hmm. that there's no difference between human beings, other than how we are in our lives and our, personalities. But there's mm-hmm. nothing wrong with someone being classified in a particular way, and we shouldn't even be classifying people in a way. That we embrace all human beings as brothers and sisters, mm-hmm. and that seems to be like where we want to go. But not all of us want to get there. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit, and if you want to share a personal experience, that'd be great. But I think it's important for the listeners that they know what we're really talking about. Like I can say from my own experience, my mom was harassed when she was working in the workplace, mm-hmm. and she would not share intimate stories, but just make it clear that there were times when the guys in the office were not cool. I remember going to her office, and she worked in New York City as a graphic artist. For a magazine, and one of her colleagues had pornographic magazines in his desk, and I didn't think anything of it other than, wow, that's just kind of weird, right? I was 13 or 14, but what? So why? I guess I don't want to ask what's wrong with that. It seems like it's obvious what's wrong with that, but maybe what's been wrong with the way business has been dealing with that?
So Yeah. So what I wanted to say, pertinent to your first question and this question, is that I don't think that much of it was done with the right intention. So while it may seem on the surface that some more fair practices were put in place, it's been quite evident to me, especially working in the federal contractor space, that it was meant to be much more a Band-Aid than an actual solution. And I think it was supposed to be a bit of a smoke and mirrors thing. The whole affirmative action plan thing is very elusive, and most people that have had to work with it, if you could get them to actually be honest with you, will tell you that it does not actually serve the people that it's intended to serve, right? So to say that their availability numbers, and you should be hiring veterans, and you should be hiring African Americans, Latinas,
Say what availability numbers are,
so availability numbers means the pool of people that are actually available to work within that demographic, within your region, in your area. So you get those numbers, that gets compiled into your affirmative action plan, but then they also look at the numbers of people that are just going into the field too. And so you get held to this standard of, just how many you should be hiring. So a lot of people tend to treat that as a quota. That's not really how you should be treating it. You should be hiring anybody and everybody because they're the best suited for your workplace, so as to have the proper composition. But the way that businesses have treated it, it's more so like, okay, so we hired 5 Black engineers, we're good. We hired 3 Latinas, we're good. And then they go back to hiring from the country club and their family pool, right? That's what I've seen. So it doesn't really serve the people it's intended for, because they're seeing it as a do-good thing, when the reality is every human being deserves the right to be gainfully employed somewhere in some capacity. And if you're always looking at it like that, then we don't have these issues. But it's really cool and super sexy to talk about diversity and inclusion as the thing that's solving for a greater societal ill, quite frankly, which is discrimination and bias and systemic racism. And those are the things I think that get very thorny, that nobody really wants to talk about. But quite frankly, diversity and inclusion, in my opinion, is a farce.
So let's talk about, because you put a lot of things in there. Let's unpack some of it. So there have been a whole bunch of regulations in the last 40 years that have kind of tried to combat the segregation of different classes of people, different types of people. So these laws, these regulations, don't apply to all companies, right?
No.
So
that's important to note. So if you are a federal contractor, meaning you have at least $50,000 in federal contracts, $50,000 in federal contracts, then you are held to a standard that says that you must affirmatively hire certain people, what they call underrepresented groups. I don't agree with that nomenclature, but that's separate and apart. So that means women, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, veterans have been added in as of a few years ago, so have the differently able population now. Right. So they must do what they call good faith efforts.
Right. And so good faith efforts are, they advertised on certain websites or in certain newspapers. That is considered good faith effort. It used to be.
So it depends on a large portion of what happens depends on who's in office. So
who's in the presidency?
In the presidency, correct. Yeah. And so at a time, I would say circa like 2008 to 2010, the person that had been at the head of OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, felt that just merely blasting on websites was enough. That was okay to do, and that was a decent enough good faith effort. Patricia Hsu, who came in thereafter, did not, and said that is very superficial. You're not really doing anything with that, and so we're going to hold you to the grindstone, and you actually need to be out there in the community with people, with associations, making sure that you're making a connection and connecting the right people to the right positions.
Right, so these are for federal, which is a very small percentage of the population. What about other companies?
So actually, believe it or not, more companies than you think are federal contractors. I mean, healthcare organizations. I've worked for...
Right, but so
Right.
we know that companies that do business
Yeah.
beyond $50,000 are held to this, but a lot
Right.
of people don't work for companies that,
So
that
yeah,
do this.
so the ones that don't, I mean, not that they can certainly be taken to court for certain,
Right.
litigious things around Title VII, but they're not held to any particular standard to
And the
hire
reason
that way.
is if a company doing business with the federal government makes a mistake, they can lose their ability to do business with the federal government.
Yes.
But a company that doesn't do business with the federal government, they may have civil penalties, like they could get sued for discrimination, but they won't lose their right to do
here's the
business.
problem with the
We'll get into the
yeah.
problems, but I want to just make sure people understand kind of the lay of the land.
Correct.
Of these rules are intended to really be enforced around organizations that do business with the federal government.
Correct.
And we hope that they, roll around to other organizations, and that happens. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I can't hard to say what the numbers are. And you're saying how poor this is. You put something in there which I thought was interesting, which is, well, how do we correct it? I think we've identified a bit of the problem, but let's talk more about the problem. Like, what are the problems? Obviously, people getting discriminated, but why is that a problem?
So
there's more than one reason, right? It's
so for instance, if we go back to the federal contractor, what's happening is because they want the money, they're doing it. Not because they care about having these people work for them, right? So they know very well how to work around the system and do just enough to keep their contracts, and do the very least in terms of making sure that the right people across those demographics are hired. So once it's tied to money, it's problematic. It's even problematic if they're not a federal contractor. I hear a lot of companies say,
well, no, but I'm saying what's the problem with not having diversity? So what's the problem with not having women in the workplace or not having veterans in the workplace?
Well, you don't. I mean, on a very basic level, you don't have diversity of thought. If you take a step back from just the actual act of you being a race demographic or differently able, whatever, there are not enough minds at the table, I don't think. And so I think you're missing a huge opportunity to be really dynamic in business right now. And I don't think that's never been the case, but certainly right now, by not having a number of different voices at the table, regardless of where they come from. In every single demographic, there's a lens that you bring to a conversation. And so, if you choose to be monochromatic in how you want to have your workforce, I think it's to the deficit of your business, quite frankly.
Yeah, and from just a research perspective, there's a huge amount of research that's come out in the last 5 years that shows that organizations that are more diverse and inclusive have higher ability to innovate, they have higher cash flow per employee, they have higher EBIT margins, earnings before interest and tax. So we know that organizations that are more diverse and inclusive perform better. And if you look at the economy today, the organizations that are winning are those that are more innovative. And so just bringing in having people who can bring different perspectives, bring their whole selves to work and contribute, that has a meaningful impact on businesses.
Yeah, so there's a business reason.
Yeah.
And then the harder argument to sell is the social and ethical and moral reasons, because sometimes we all have different compasses around that.
Yeah, but I think that it's important to remember those, right? I mean, over the last, 30 years, we've had such a focus on our shareholders as a place to return. Mm-hmm. But I think what we're seeing now as we look around is there's a bereft. We've been bereft of benefiting our stakeholders, and our stakeholders are our communities and our people who are in our organizations. And again, we know, beyond ethical and social, we know organizations that also consider their stakeholders, including their employees and communities, also tend to perform better. So it's important from a social, ethical perspective, and it's important from a business perspective. And
also, I think some of these things make the workplace safer, right? I mean, if you're hiring in a more skills-based, more aptitude-based way, and not on what you might physically see about somebody or think about somebody as a person, then it's safer for other people to work there.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, one thing that also occurs to me, and I'd love your thoughts on this, but if we kind of look around where we are right now, in so many ways we're becoming more isolated. We're on our phones, we're watching TV, we're not engaging in meaningful conversations. And the workplace is still one of the places where we are engaging in meaningful conversations with people who might have different perspectives. And so having the skills and the capabilities to have those conversations is something that workplaces need to foster to make diversity and inclusion work within them. But I think it's also just a skill that's a benefit for our society right now.
Yeah, I think so there is the aspect of psychological safety that I like to focus on a lot.
You talked about that yesterday.
Yeah,
which is that,
you know, if I see people that look like me culturally, then suddenly, you know, there is some evidence to suggest that I feel more psychologically safe in that environment to express myself versus if I'm one. In that environment. And so, you know, people do need to see themselves at many different levels within an organization, but there's also the assimilation factor that I think businesses miss, which is that you can actually have those people there and they cannot feel assimilated into the culture and into the business. And so, you know, if they don't have that, then there's a separate issue, because now you start to have these little tribes, you know, among themselves within the workplace, similar to what we see play out in society, right? And people isolate themselves, and that's not good for culture or teams or anything, because now you don't have people talking to one another, collaborating, and so no innovation happens in those situations. So that's something I would say businesses should really focus on, is that assimilation factor.
I know we're kind of bouncing around here, but let's go down that thread of how do you get an organization that has 20 or 30 different groups to collaborate when they don't collaborate anyway. And often in those groups, you'll have a homogeneous culture, right? So let's say the engineering group might be all white males, and the HR group may be all females, and this group may be all another, you know, population.
So something I've encouraged is I think that we've not given enough credit to the power of storytelling, right, within organizations. So just simply the act of, not a town hall, nothing, you know, like static like that, but I mean getting people in a room very informally and saying, hey, let's just share. Like, what are your pain points? Where are you failing? What's going on in your area? Let's just share about that. And a lot of times when you can get people sharing that way, or you can get a few people to be that vulnerable, suddenly you open up the ground and people realize, like, wow, my challenges are not my challenges. There are challenges because Jim over there in engineering is experiencing some of the same, you know, or perhaps I've gotten over that challenge and I can help Jim figure out how to kind of look at that a different way. So I really think that there's a power in like doing things really informally and not doing some of the stuff that we've kind of done over the past 30 years and just getting even just a few people to open up. Everybody doesn't need to open up. And that's the other thing too, is there's a penchant for when like a few people don't open up in that way, we say, oh, there's interpersonal issues with that person. And the thing is you've got to just, with everything, deal with your allies, deal with the ones in the middle, and you're going to have detractors. Deal with the ones that will engage, and then hope that the ones right in the middle will catch on. Just keep doing it. And they'll start to see that there is room for them to be vulnerable in some way and maybe have those discussions. And to me, that's a good place to start.
Yeah, that bridge, and maybe I'd love to hear both of you talk about that. With most organizations, and I've been in a lot, you know, people are reserved, right? There's a safety in being reserved, right? And not speaking out, not sticking your head too far above the fray. But if you do that, and you are vulnerable, that something bad could happen, right? So how do you reconcile that for somebody who works? Like, why would I be vulnerable? Sure, I'll go to this event and I'll just listen and but I'm not saying anything because I don't want to lose my job, right? This isn't like when you're in a relationship with your primary person that you can say stuff and they're going to be with you. This is work where people get fired, people get promoted, people get raises, people don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about creating structure to create a safe space. So, if we're talking about storytelling, what are the parameters, right? So, certainly don't want people to go out there and say, well, let me tell you about this thing that's actually illegal or is, really, really bad. But I think putting, in general, as we're thinking about changing cultures, changing how organizations operate and the people interact with each other, it's about putting those boundaries around, okay, these are the types of things that we should be sharing. These are the types of things that, how we should be responding on the other side, so that you are creating that safe space to be vulnerable. Another thing that I've heard is really potentially important in organizations that have addressed challenges they have, is giving people the skills, certainly to have hard conversations, but also to manage conflict. So much of this comes down to, you have a homogenous group of some sort that has one perspective, and another group has another perspective, or individuals, if there's not enough of that other group, you have individuals who have their perspective. And how do you engage in a meaningful dialogue to bring out those ideas, to acknowledge and honor them, but then eventually to come together as a group, a new group, moving forward. And so having those skills, like I said, around hard conversations and managing conflict is important too.
One of the things I loved about what you said yesterday, Janine, was that under all of it, we all have hurt, right?
Yeah,
Fundamentally, there's a pain there that we don't want to admit, right? And I think that's kind of the bottom line. I know it's the bottom line of my life, bottom line of my relationships with people I know. Yeah. How do we puncture that, penetrate that, so that there's an opportunity for the pain to get released or expressed?
So I do this workshop, quite often about ideal work relationships, and one of the things that I do in that workshop is, it's called Today I Brought With Me. And so it's like a bag. It's like a bag that I draw up, and I have the people at the table talk about, like, when they woke up that morning, what did they bring to work with them? And so they write, they don't share amongst themselves, they just write out, what they brought with them. And then I ask them to share it with their group, and then I ask them to share it to the larger group. And you wouldn't imagine the things that people share. I woke up this morning, I was depressed. I woke up this morning and I didn't feel well. I got into an argument with my husband, or I'm really scared about this presentation. And the last time that I did it, people that had got up and shared certain things, the people in their group that they had worked, they were like, oh my God, I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And suddenly there's this empathy that just happens serendipitously, because so many times in the workplace we see one another. You might be stoic in nature, or you're not smiling as much, and people say, oh, she's got an attitude, or she doesn't want to help me. And what they don't get is that there are things that belie that. Yeah. And so in that scenario, you're able to cut through what looks on the surface as attitude, as all the things that help us feel from an ego perspective that, like, they're wrong, I'm right. And it gets you to connect with another human being. And suddenly it was like, wow, well, maybe I should just ask that person if they're okay now, versus then make that snap judgment. So I think just like little exercises like that among teams can work magic, because you get people to cut past their ego and actually regard humans as humans, which we all are, right? We all have good days and bad days.
Right.
Yeah. I think it gets to an overall shift that we've actually seen at this conference and in many other places, which is moving towards a more human workplace. So a place where we are able to kind of bring our own selves and we acknowledge other people for their whole selves, less of seeing people as just a means to an end of doing the work, and more of us as a community of people working together towards something great. I think that's a big shift that we're seeing overall in terms of how people are talking about the workplace, and it has meaningful implications for.
We're going to take a quick break, and I'll have to come back and talk about how work can be like a competition for resources and not necessarily a nurturing place. We'll be right back in a second. Hi, I'm Lorne Epstein, and you're listening to The Lorne Epstein Show, where we talk about jobs, careers, and the workplace, here on 96.7 FM. If you're interested in being on the show, you can give me a call at 240-876-9666. 0276 or email me at Lorne, Lorne, at electriccow.com. You can check out our Facebook page, which is Lorne Epstein, and also our Mixcloud account. So if you go to mixcloud.com, Lorne Epstein, you'll find our shows. Thanks so much. Welcome back. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein, and today we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and we'll be talking about the Me Too movement. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about like that real pressure of the competition of resources. You know, why didn't I get paid as much, or why am I getting paid more? Those kinds of things that people. And what you said, Janine, that exercise, that sounds great. I think that is wonderful. And how do we get past, like when you say just do it, but how do we get past the resistance to having this kind of conversation in the workplace?
It's so in a lot of ways, the reason why we're here, right? This point in time where it appears that employees don't trust employers is because trust was eroded. It was never built to begin with, right? And part of how that happened, it was lack of communication. And I think Gary Hamel kind of alluded to this, is that we've been treating grown adults as infants, as children. It's almost like as if it was romper room. You know, you're an adult when you're out there, but when you come here, we're going to treat you like a 2 or 3 year old. So much so that, for instance, you know, if we're going through a reduction in force, for instance, and something's happening within the business, there's whispers around, things get around. You know, you got that one manager that can't shut their mouth and they confide in their employee and suddenly gets around. And so people come to know there's going to be a reduction in force, except we don't hear from the people that it matters from, right? We find out at the last minute that my job's gone. Meanwhile, I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got kids to feed. How much do you trust me? How much do I trust you when you treat me that way, right? Whereas I would have rathered if you let me know when the business was in trouble and just simply said, look, we're in trouble. And I don't know how we're going to engage you to help us, or if you can, or if, you know, but we may have to let some people go. But we want to let you know so that you can get your affairs in order if you must.
Yeah.
Should that happen. So that level of transparency changes the game. And if companies had done that from the very beginning around a great many issues, we wouldn't be here having this discussion now. But it's always been this thing of, I'm here because it's a hierarchy and you peons are down here, and you know, we'll engage you when we so choose, and you're expendable at any expense. And so when you treat people like that, it's just like a relationship, right? If I treated my husband like that, I would be divorced. You know, this is just how it is. And so if we look at it as a relationship and not as I'm giving you a job and you should be ever so thankful, which has really been the mantra and the message, I think a lot of this could be different. Now it's going to be hard. I tell businesses that hire me all the time, it's going to be hard. You have a long road to rebuilding that trust, especially in light of the Me Too movement and all these things that are coming out. You really are going to have to work hard to build that trust. And it's going to be hard, it's going to be rough, and a lot of people are not going to be on board, but you got to try still.
So let's pivot a little. What do you think of the Me Too movement?
I think that it is a movement, obviously a long time in coming, right? So we know that these things have been happening for years, and you know, you referenced at the beginning your mom, her experience in the workplace. I was actually at a different conference recently and engaged in a Twitter exchange with somebody, and she was saying, she's like, well, when it comes to sexual harassment, in my mom's day, they used to grade it, not report it.
Were you part of that?
I was part of that.
Get out, yes.
Yes, and it was just, you know.
What did she mean?
She meant that they would grade how bad this sexual harassment was.
Comparative to the last.
Yeah, compared to the last one.
Yeah.
So the last sexual harassment was a C, and this one was an A, or, you know, just in terms of the extremeness.
A being worse but better.
Right. Yeah. A being worse but better. Yes. So this has obviously been a long time in coming. I think the fact that so many women have come forward and consistently expressed their experiences has made it impossible to deny. And the fact that so many women who had a huge amount to lose have come forward, whether you're talking about celebrities who came forward, or just ordinary women who have. I think it's the power of the numbers to make it undeniable that this is still happening. It's still an issue. I think a lot of people thought it wasn't anymore. It absolutely is. And so I think it's overall a really good thing. That said, it has, as people, I think, try to process it, they've maybe also tried to diminish it. And meaning that, some people have said, well, with Me Too, can I still give a hug in the workplace, or, something like that, which is a totally ridiculous thing to say.
Actually, I got to tell you, so my male friends, we don't hug women at work. I would never hug a woman at work, unless like she went in to hug me, and then I would still be like, not 100% sure. And I'm a hugger.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a super hugger.
But the thing is that nobody in Me Too is complaining because of a hug.
That part.
No, totally, that's true.
And I understand that it makes,
right.
the movement makes some people uncomfortable because they don't know how to respond.
Right.
But the thing is the conversation is being changed from sexual harassment and abuse to can I hug? And that's not the conversation we should be having.
Well, here's why I say that. And I want to hear from you too, Janine. But so my experience, it was a long time ago, I started a job at a place, and one of my colleagues came in, and we were talking, and I'm like, so, she was asking me about my life. I said, so are you married? And, an hour later, our boss came in and like, are you hitting on her? And so I'm like, okay, I'm not talking to her anymore. I'm never going to talk to her again. And I'm definitely not going to ask, so that is like, it's like the fleas in the jar, right? You put the lid on, the fleas try to get out, you take the lid off, and they just won't get out because they won't go beyond that pain point. And I think that, I don't know about other men, but I can tell you that even if you haven't had the experience, someone who's had the experience, or you can cognate that, that is possible, and my job and my livelihood and my reputation are way more important than me giving you a hug. Like, I don't need to give you a hug, that's just how that's how the calculus is in my head.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because everybody's making that calculus. But I guess I would come back to, do you need to give that person a hug? Or you could just have a conversation with them like any other coworker.
Right.
No, and so there's nothing wrong with it.
We may be okay with a hug, and I'm saying, not.
And that's fine.
Right.
So it's like, okay, so maybe we give a few fewer hugs in the workplace, but
it even gets down to like, what kind of conversations do we have? What do we say with each other? How do we say what we say with each other? What words do we use?
I mean, see, I have a bit, I struggle, I think, like Stacia a bit.
Because there's the obvious stuff, right, what we're talking about. There's obvious, right?
It is. So to her initial point, Me Too's a long time coming.
Yeah.
With most movements, historically, it's all about timing. So this has been going on a really long time, and for whatever reason, given the state of affairs, the timing was just right and ripe for this. I don't necessarily think it's the sheer numbers that made the difference, because the numbers have always been there. Nobody wanted to hear it, so that lets me know it's timing alone, right? And so time's up, right? Here we are, and I struggle a little bit with the mindset that suddenly men don't know how to comport themselves around women, right? So it's almost to say you've been on, and this is not all men, by the way, but the men that were doing these things, you were on the complete grossest end of things, right? That was okay for years,
right?
And it's still okay for many of them. They don't give a crap. But now we're asking you to be really just a gentleman, right? And suddenly you just don't understand what that equates to. You need some guidance on that, and it's problematic across any marginalized group. As a Black woman, it's like saying, okay, well, you enslaved us years ago, right? And suddenly now from there, you don't know how to treat us like human beings, and still they don't, but fine, separate and apart, right? So it's like, no, we're asking you to be human. And like for me personally, I don't have a problem with a hug from a coworker I enjoy, right? I would not, like you, I would not do that, like reach out for one, but I'm not opposed to it even in the land of Me Too. The conversation is around the gross misconduct and how women were held back in jobs and positions and held almost captive because of men that use that in that way. So, and to that point, I'm not ultra mad at men. I think men have suffered a ton too. And I think they are suffering. I think there's some attention to pay to that, which is that, you know, most women grew up, boys will be boys. Men are going to be men. You know, if a man wants to be lewd with you, that's what men do. Very few people got a message otherwise. And so there's unlearning, I think, on both ends. There's a very nasty undercurrent to the Me Too movement, right? So I'm very glad that it's here, but there's a nasty undercurrent that says that men suck. They should go to another planet, and it should be all right, and it should be all women. And I don't think that that's the answer. I think we all need to be talking to one another. I think everybody needs to be heard. I think there's some hurt that has to be addressed with men. I think men should be allowed to be more vulnerable than they currently can be across whether or not they're heterosexual or homosexual or whatever that is, because that tends to be attributed to being homosexual if you're a man and more vulnerable, right? Depending on what generation you come from, of course, right? Because I think the younger generations get this a little bit more right than some of the older generations. But it's a problem. I'm glad it's here. It's a mirror for us to look at ourselves and see where we've missed the mark over the years. And I mean, I'm fairly optimistic in a sense that things are going to change for the better. I don't see it as a negative. I think women are really going to just kind of grab this by the horns and show society how it should be done. And I think we'll get to a better place, but it had to happen. We had to break down so that we can be better. I mean, that's kind of how this always has been. Yeah.
So where do you think how do you think this movement can or should impact, like at the ground level of the workplace?
Well, I think we are seeing it impact in some of the stories in the news, right? Where this sexual harassment or failure of women to be promoted or put into different jobs or the pay gap for women is having some really meaningful impacts on organizations today. So whether, you know, just some of the ones in the headlines, got Nike and that the implications of what was happening there, taking out a number of people who were very senior in the organization, really disrupting their succession plans.
Just share with the audience because they may not be familiar.
Yeah, so at Nike there was a group of senior women who put a surveyor out in the organization to understand how the women were being treated, their promotions, their promotion rate, and if they thought that they were being discriminated against. They then sent the results of that survey to the CEO, who ordered an investigation into the incident, and as a result there have been, I believe it's at least 11 leaders who have left Nike, including the immediate successor to the CEO.
Wow. And when did this happen?
This came out in the news about 3 weeks ago. And the actual survey, I think, took place in the beginning of this year. So, and so there's all sorts of other stories. Actually, in Europe, in London or in England in particular, we're seeing a lot of this, particularly financial services. A lot of companies over there are publishing what their gender pay gaps are, and so we're just seeing it everywhere.
So let me ask you a question, because let's talk about this Nike thing. So is that the solution, right? So the idea of getting a sense of how women in the organization are being treated, right? And then taking that information and saying, okay, this is what happened, and let's say those 11 people who left were the perpetrators. You did these things to suppress these women or hold these women down.
Well, I think we got to be careful with the word perpetrators.
Okay,
These people were either participated or condoned it happening, because those are individuals who are influencing the culture of the organization. So,
so they may have not done it, but they may have not they may have ignored it.
So
I'm just curious what was their role in the. I don't know.
I mean, there's an ongoing conversation in the HR community about, you know, how culpable are HR professionals to the stuff that's going on in the organizations, right? So in a large part, HR does the bidding of the C-suite for the most part. There are not very many HR professionals that have the ability nor gumption to think outside of the box and act outside of the box. That's honest. So, you know, they're just doing the bidding. Part of what I've tried to be on a soapbox about, having been a practitioner, is that HR practitioners need to hold themselves to a higher standard. They do. And as much as they want to serve the business, you've got to decide whether the things that you're doing to people on a day-to-day basis lies within your value structure, and if it makes sense from a moral and ethical standpoint. What HR was and what it was developed upon was to do good for people. Somewhere along the line, we started talking about things like impacting bottom line, but we are here to impact people and work experiences. And so if you aren't doing the greater good by people, you've got to check yourself, I think. And so there just was a license for a really long time for HR to do a lot of really crappy things to people, because the C-suite said, hey, go for it, you know? And so good, bad, or indifferent, if it's your job, you're going to do your job, right? But still the blame is going to fall firmly on HR, unfortunately. You know, if there's going to be a scapegoat, it's going to be the HR person, not the C-suite.
Well, but hang on a second. Wait, I want to just ask, because I don't know this Nike story, and it's interesting. So did the 11 people that left, were they all men?
There was one woman.
There was one woman. And so so there's no assertion about what they did. They just left. And that's the story.
I think that it hasn't come out, right?
Gotcha.
So I'm sure within Nike, there's probably been plenty of assertions, but in the news, in the New York Times, it hasn't come out.
Okay, so
let's
say, because in my mind, when you tell me the story, my first thought is like, something was going on. All these women complained, and these people are now out.
Well,
they got their justice.
Well, let's be clear. These people had complained for years. So this survey was kind of the final tipping point, but they had complained to HR for years, is what the New York Times article said. So, you know, I think there are a couple things going on. One is that, to Janine's point, HR has had a certain mandate, and diversity and inclusion, by and large, has not fit within it. Diversity and inclusion in most organizations is a separate group. Sometimes it'll report into HR, sometimes it'll report into directly into the CEO, and in some places it reports into some basic compliance.
Ombudsman, I've seen some weird stuff.
There's some weird stuff.
Yeah.
But so when it comes to, we have an issue with regard to harassment or promotions or pay equity, et cetera, it's unclear whose responsibility it ultimately is. And so you combine that with the fact that HR has a whole bunch of other things that are on their plate. We haven't seen any of this explode like it did, so it's kind of like, well, that's a low risk problem. And then the issues get ignored. And that's what's changed.
So you're saying that the situation at Nike was that there was a problem going on, but there wasn't a mechanism to solve it for these years, and what you're saying is that HR didn't own it?
There likely was a mechanism.
Yeah.
You know, when your kids...
Not a working mechanism.
Right, but like, you know, when your kids get away with keep taking cookies from the cookie jar and you don't see it and you don't notice it, they keep taking cookies from the cookie jar, right? It's the same thing here. Like, nobody was slapping their hands. Even from a litigious standpoint, yeah, we've seen some pretty large lawsuits over the years for certain things, but a lot of the stuff that goes on flies way under the radar and never even hits any kind of litigation because there's a loophole.
So what would you want to see? Because these people that left, right, presumably they lost their jobs. They probably have lost their reputations. They may never be employable again. Whatever's happened to them, these 11 people are now kind of SOL. And,
maybe. I mean, we'll see.
Maybe, but there's a possibility, and I'm pointing to it because I want to say, well, what could have we done if we're going to say, let's fix this problem? Because it seems to me that if the kids taking the if my kid was taking the cookies out of the cookie jar, I wouldn't kick him out of the house.
No, but yeah.
What would we do to solve the problem? Because I'm accountable for that, in my workplace. In my relationship with my wife, in my relationship with friends, I let people get away with stuff, and then finally it's like, no, you can't do this, right? So we have to. What would you want to see as a professional, but also as a woman, to feel like, okay, it's good now?
Well, I think one of the positive things that's come out of Me Too is that women are being believed more.
Yes.
What it used to be is number one, most people wouldn't report because of fear of retaliation. So that would be the starting point. The second point is, well, how do you prove it? And the burden was always on the victim.
Right.
Yeah.
So you need to prove that this happened. Well, how am I going to prove that this not great thing happened where it's just the two of us, because that's where harassment happens. So I think that as a starting point, we need to put in place structures that enable people to report and real investigations with some sort of teeth if there is a sense that something negative happened, so that people can track that over time. So if 5 people report on the same person doing something, that gets flagged, as opposed to these one-off reports that go away into HR and nothing ever happens.
Sure.
And then organizations need to have the guts to do something. I mean, that is something.
And what would be the thing that we would do?
Well, if it's clear that this has happened on a repeated basis, you take serious action, like Nike did eventually.
So would there be any in between steps of like,
Yeah, of course
hey,
there
you
would.
have some, like if somebody was an alcoholic or a drug addict and they were at work, is there some remediation that we say, look, obviously this person is valuable to the company in some way, how do we, help them?
Well,
Or is by helping them, like, do we just say, nope?
I mean, it's really left up to the devices of the company, right? So
But
the
I'm
company,
curious as to what you would love to see,
so what I'm
'cause-
saying is, like, I mean,
Because your voice is being heard now.
it
What you
really
guys are saying.
it really depends. For me, I'd prefer to see, for the more egregious things, a zero tolerance policy. You're out. Under normal circumstances, we would progressively discipline,
Sure.
right? And we try to help the person along. You mentioned alcoholism. We might send them to EAP, separate and apart. But I mean, as far as you making somebody uncomfortable in their skin in the workplace, there should be a zero tolerance policy. You're out, and I think, to Stacia's point, having really safe points and being very clear in your communication during the investigation process of those things with the people that are reporting that is important, so that they understand that under no certain terms will they be retaliated against or lose their jobs. From a structural perspective, I want to see more engagement among the different factions of HR. There are too many silos within HR. And a lot of this stuff could have been solved just based on conversation, right?
Yeah.
So the compensation people, they're the ones that own that process of pay equity and how people get compensated. It's their jobs, from my perspective, to keep a handle on looking at that data constantly, slice and dice that data and drill it down. How many Black women are getting paid, at this management level, this. Okay, now let's slice it and look at Latinas. Let's slice it and look at white women and compare and see where there may be gaps. And when there are gaps, being honest enough and transparent to say, hey, there is a gap, and then fix the gap if they can be. And even if you can't fix, a lot of businesses are like, well, it may cost them a lot, right? Maybe it was years of gross negligence. You don't have to fix it all in one felt swoop. Maybe all you do is have a discussion with those people and apologize and say, listen, we just looked at this data. We weren't doing it right. Allow us to make it right in time. Here's our plan to do it, and we're gonna honor that. But we can't, do this for whatever business reason. Most people who are reasonable can deal with that. But it's when you don't trust them and you're not that transparent, and you kind of gloss over it and say, well, so yeah, you're paid less. I mean, work harder. Or you're paid less. We don't have that money to fix it. I don't know what to tell you, but we'll fix it in time. Who wants to hear that?
Well, thank you.
It has to be a plan. There has to be, because so many people have not been willing to do this analysis for years because they're afraid of the legal implications. Meaning that if they identify that there's a problem, they will legally liable to fix it. And that has kept people from looking at all sorts of diversity numbers. And so I think the upside of this movement is it's saying, look, the potential risk of this being wrong, of there being something that goes wrong and it becoming public and everything going off the rails is big enough that you need to be willing to take on that legal risk. And then you have to make a plan to do something, because this could be a major problem for your business moving forward if you continue with the gender pay inequities or by different diversity groups. So we think that what the movement has done is it's made the pressure much greater, but people have to act. They need to do the analysis, but they have to act. They can't just do the analysis and then do nothing.
I would actually argue that the perception of inequity is far worse than the litigation, right? Because I mean, at the enterprise level, I've seen many of them have the money to just pay these people off and settle. Like, let's be real about it. But this new digital age that we're in, where you have to be subject to the court of public opinion before you hit the court, that is far more damaging. When a social campaign hits the ground running, like a Me Too, a Time's Up, or when Dove screwed up and so many other brands screwed up, in the past 2 to 3 years, that now you're losing customers, right? So it's not even just that you damaged your workforce, you're losing customers, you're losing faith in your products. That's money for years and years and years to come,
Sure. So with that, we're just about out of time. How can folks, by the way, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And how can folks reach out to you?
Folks can reach out to me. I'm Stacia at RedThread Research. If they want to drop me an email or follow me on Twitter, I'm at Stacia Garr, and would love to hear from folks.
Awesome.
Janine Truitt, Chief Innovations Officer for Talent Think Innovations. You can find me at www.talentthinkinnovations.com, the Aristocracy of HR, and I'm at Czarina of HR on Twitter.
Awesome. And how do you spell Czarina?
It's CZARINA of HR.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. You've been listening to the Lorne Epstein Show. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein, here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. And we'll see you next week.